Yo, what is good, dev guys? Welcome back to part 6 of this video tutorial series. In this video, I want to go ahead and add the components to the actor class that we need, and we'll go ahead and start building out the code inside of Blueprint that will get our async loading system working. So let's go ahead and get that started. So here under my protected section, I'm going to just add a couple of components. I won't need to add a region or anything like that, mainly because we're only going to add 2 components here. So the first component is going to be a use static mesh component, and it's going to be a pointer, and we're going to call this our async static mesh. And I'm not sure if I need to forward declare that. And let me add a U property as well. So I want this to be edit anywhere in Blueprint read write. And it's going to be in the category of meshes. Let me go ahead and copy that U property, take it down here, and we want to create a U skeletal mesh component. And make that a pointer. We call this our async skeletal mesh. And actually what I want to do here is I want to use our custom classes that we created. So let's forward declare that is actually UAL underscore skeletal mesh. And I think it's comp, C-O-M-P. Yeah, comp, short for component. And then we got the same thing up here, UAL underscore static mesh comp. And I think this will work the exact same way. In the example project, I didn't add these in C++. I added them in Blueprint. So it might be the same thing. I might not even need to include these or do it this way, but we'll test it out. So let's go to our header file. I mean our CPP file. Let me turn this ticking off here. Just get rid of that. And then I want to go ahead and create our components. So we got our async skeletal first. Let's do async skeletal is equal to create default subobject. And so of type UAL underscore skeletal mesh comp. We're going to call this our skeletal mesh comp. And let's go ahead and include the definition of our skeletal mesh comp, which is included in parts/skeletal/al underscore skeletal mesh comp.h. And do the same thing for our async static mesh. Create default subobject, give it the type UAL underscore static mesh, and give it a name. Static mesh comp. And go ahead and include the definition. This in parts static UAL static mesh comp.h. I'm gonna get rid of this tick function. We don't need it. So let me delete it over here. And that's pretty much all we need to do for this actor in C++. So I'm gonna go ahead and run the editor. Does not exist in the project. I can walk on the water. Okay, with the editor opened up, let's go ahead and work on our actor class, which is here. So instead of these print strings, we want to do a few things. One thing I forgot to do, I forgot to attach these to the root component. So let me actually go back to C++ and let's attach these to the root component so that they're not all weird. So let's say async skeletal mesh dot setup attachment, and let's just give it the root component here. Async static mesh dot setup attachment, and give it the root component. It might not change anything. I believe in the example project I had like a box component. It wasn't really doing anything though. It was just there. So with that, I'm gonna go back into the editor and run the shortcut to compile my module again. So I'm gonna recompile the module for this game, quote unquote. So, okay, got a successful hot reload, and yeah, it didn't do anything. It doesn't really matter though. That's fine. So what we want to do here is we want to create a function over here, and this function will be the function that we call whether we load our async static on a loop or we load our async static one at a time. Same thing for skeletal. So we'll create two functions here. So let's go ahead, create a function, call it load static meshes, and then create another function, and we're going to call this load skeletal meshes. And let's start with static. This will pretty much be the same for both of these. We need to do one more thing. We need to create a variable based on that data asset that we created. So let's go ahead and call this hard data. And it needs to be of type, what is that data asset? See here. It is YT async loading .al part al part data. Okay, that's what it is. al underscore part data. That's what we need right there. We need a hard object reference since everything on it is soft. And I'm going to compile that, and I'm going to pass in our async test data asset. And now with this, we could go ahead and use this to get our array of static meshes. So get available static parts, and this will give us a static mesh that we could use if it's loaded. So what we want to do is get a copy of this static mesh, but we always want to load it randomly. So I'm going to right click and do random integer in range, and I want to give it 0 and the length of this array -1, so that we could stay in, arrays are 0 based. So let me subtract 1 from this array here and pass that in as my max. And now it'll get a random value based on the amount of available parts in this array, and it'll select one of those and pass it on to us. So here we need to go ahead and get our, our static mesh. Let's get our static mesh and set static mesh. And we can go ahead and get, we need to get the static mesh right here. And we can pass this in if it's valid. If this is valid, let's go ahead and set it here. So pass that there. And basically what this code is doing is saying, hey, I got an array of available parts. Get a random one based on the amount of random parts. And let's get the static mesh of that static mesh part. And let's set the static mesh of our static mesh component to that static mesh. And only do that if the static mesh coming out of here is valid. So if it's not valid, let's print a string. And that string will basically say that we haven't loaded the data. And with this, we can go ahead and copy this. Well, we can just retype it. It's not going to be too long. So let's get the hard data. Let's get the available skeletal mesh parts this time. And let's get a copy of the random in range. Well, let me just get the length of this here and subtract 1, because I know I want to get 1 inside of the array. And let's get a random integer in range. That's a random float. Random integer in range. Pass in this value here and pass this to here. And from here, we want to get the skeletal mesh. And if that is valid, we want to go ahead and set our skeletal mesh here. And do that here. Pass that through here. And pass that through here. And if this is not valid, we want to print a string. If I can spell print right. And say we have not loaded the data. And I should say which data, depending on what function is running this. So I'm going to say skeletal in all caps. And then I'm going to go back to my static meshes and I'm going to type static in all caps so I can know. Okay. And with that, technically, we should be able to load these static meshes whenever we have the data. So we need to be able to get the data. And we do that through the try async load. So instead of this print string, what we want to do here is get our hard data. And there's a function on our hard data asset. Remember, we created it a few videos back. We're going to async load. And this is skeletal. So we want to do request async load skeletal part. And pass that in here. We can get rid of this. And for our data owner, we want to just send in a reference of self. This is just the actor that is in the world so that we can get the world from it. And this will request the async load of our skeletal parts. And we need to do the same thing. So let me copy that and put it over here for static. So we're going to request an async load for the static parts here. Get rid of this print string, pass this here, and we want to also get a reference to self. I just highlighted this and press Control W for people who don't know the keyboard shortcuts. And that will go ahead and request the async load of our static parts and our skeletal parts. And now we can do this event on random load static. For this, all we want to do is load our static meshes right here. So that's what will happen when we press this event static load button, event on random load static button. And for the loop, we want to do this function here on a timer. So let's say timer by function name here. So I'm gonna get rid of this print string. We want to do a timer by function name, and for this is the static. So let's just, I'm gonna press F2 on this, copy this so that I don't make any mistakes, and paste it here. This is the function that we want to run. We want it to loop here. and we want it to run every 1 second, I guess. Or maybe say 2 seconds. And then let's go ahead and create a handle reference here, a handle variable, so that we can clear this timer when we want to. So this is a static loop load handle, and we'll be doing this same thing for our loop for the skeletal. So I'm gonna just copy this, and I know that the name of this function is load skeletal meshes. So whoops, let me spell it right. So we want to do it the same way, 2 seconds and looping. I'm gonna control click this here to move that line over there. And let's also create a reference to this handle here. So skeletal loop handle, just so we can clear it whenever we unload. And we need to give this function here for our skeletal mesh for our event random load. So we'll just grab our function load skeletal meshes and pass it there. And let's see where we're at. So I'm gonna compile this. I'm gonna save this, and we didn't save the level with our actor in it. So I'm going to drag this bad boy in there. And I'm just going to press play here, see what we get. And I'm gonna shift F1, and I'm gonna try to load a random skeletal asset single, and it'll tell me that I haven't loaded the skeletal data. It should say the same thing for static, but once we try to async load the data and then load, it'll say we still haven't loaded the data. Okay, so something's happening. We are accessing none because we don't have a valid skeletal mesh. So obviously that means I didn't fill out the data asset, and to my knowledge that is true. So I'm gonna dismiss this, and now let's fill out the data asset here. So we want to give it the available parts, and we want to give it the skeletal parts to find. So here I want to say my first one is a skeletal part 1, and we'll give it part 1. Add another one and give it skeletal part 2 and pass in part 2. Add one more, and we want to give it skeletal part 3 and pass in part 3. And we'll do the same thing for static parts here. So add static part 1 and then pass in part 1. Then we want to add static part 2 and pass in part 2. Same thing, static part 3 and pass in part 3. And for our skeletal parts to find array, we just want to say find these 3 parts: skeletal part 1, part 2, part 3. And this will be our keys that we use to search for these values here. Do the same thing for static. We want to find static part 1, part 2, and part 3. So save that, and let's save this level. And now if I press play and try to shift F1, if I try to load, it'll tell me we have not loaded the data. And same thing for static. But if I try async load now, it should go ahead and oh, I didn't. What's going on there? Okay, guys, after doing some digging, I found the bug. I am a complete fool. So all this is working with our game instance, but we haven't changed our game instance. So we're calling to our game instance, but our game instance doesn't have any of the functionality because we're using the base game instance. So I'm gonna pass in my AL game instance here. I can show you guys how I found this. So basically, I went in and just debugged my code here. I wanted to see, after I tried to load some data asynchronously, I wanted to see what was the length of this array here. And when I went ahead and printed it, it was 0. But if I go ahead and do it now, like, so if I load a random static, it should say 0. But if I async load, and now that we have our game mode in, it should say 3. You see, now we have 3. So with the other game mode, we didn't have the call that we created here in our part data code. We didn't have, this wasn't getting ran right here. So this would just return. This would just return out because we tried to get our game instance from our data owner and we tried to cast it to our custom game instance. And of course, this was coming back as a null pointer because we were using the base game instance. But now that we've passed in our game instance, we got to this point here and actually loaded our data. So let's go ahead and jump back in there and let's hook everything. Let me hook everything back up here. Pass that there. Oh, whoops. Yeah, here, -1. And here, and we want to get the static mesh. If that's valid, we want to go ahead and set that right there. And now we can go ahead and give it a real test here. Excuse me for that, tripping over myself. So if I press play here, and then let me just get in a place where I can see it. Let's try to load a static mesh. We get nothing. Oh, actually, we get something because we loaded this data already, so it's already loaded for us. So you see it's loading something every time. Looks like we only have 2. Oh no, okay, so everything is going through the floor. So let me just move this up a bit here. Let me put it up in the world there. So load this asset. Let's see what we get. We get nothing. 1. Is this our async asset right here? Is that our async actor? Oh, we got more than one. Okay. I am a fool. So we do have one in the world. Let me move this up here. Surprised that didn't crash the engine, but I guess we are only getting this, the first one. So let me load here, and you see, there we go. I'm not seeing our, oh, there it is. It's very small. That is our third static mesh right there. So if I put this on a loop, it'll go ahead and just run through those every 2 seconds. And the same thing with the, let me stop this and let me press play and let me try to load the random skeletal. You'll see we'll get our error message that we haven't loaded the data. But once we load the data and we go ahead and just run that on a loop, you'll start seeing our skeletal meshes pop up every 2 seconds here. And so basically our async system is working. In the next video, I want to go ahead and work on the unloading. What are we getting here? Loads skeletal meshes is valid. Let me see if that pops up again. So here. Okay, we didn't get that error more than once, so it's fine. But yeah, in the next video, I want to go ahead and work on unloading and finalizing this out by actually spawning in our actor versus having it already in the world. So if you guys are ready for that, join me in the next video, and I'll see you guys in there. Peace.